Hello, and welcome back to Policy Voices, the podcast from Friends of Europe. I'm your host, Sabina, Șancu, and this week I'm bringing you a special episode as part of our Women, Peace and Security initiative. As the UN Resolution on Women, Peace and Security, WPS, approaches its 25th anniversary, the credibility of its global implementation is facing increasing scrutiny. There's been formal commitments from over 100 countries and major institutions, from the EU to NATO and the UN, but the agenda continues to struggle with turning rhetoric into reality. In this crucial moment, Friends of Europe is launching the Frontline Voices Women Shaping Peace and Security in Ukraine initiative in partnership with Canada's Department of National Defence via the Mobilizing Insights in Defence and Security MINDS program. Our Frontline Voices project included a series of working groups and reports, which you can consult on our website. And as part of that, we're also doing a few podcasts to complement some of the discussions that people had on the working groups and to give new insights through very particular case studies. So this week's episode is a case study of Ukraine. We're looking at women, peace, and security through the perspective of two people working very closely with the situation on the front lines and behind them, who can tell us a bit more about how gender roles shaped Ukraine before the war, how they were changed by the war, and what the future may have in store for Ukraine's women. Together with my colleague, Eugenia Rossi, we interviewed Maksimas Milta, who is the Ukraine country director at the Reckoning Project. The Reckoning Project brings on-the-ground investigative journalists together with witnesses who can give testimonies of what they've seen in terms of human rights violations, war crimes, and atrocities. And together with lawyers, these can be turned into actual testimonies in the court of law and, of course, importantly, also in the court of public opinion. Our other guest is Olena Suslova, who's the senior analyst at Women's Information Consultative Center in Ukraine. She's an experienced human rights lawyer and gender activist who has over 30 years of experience and research as well. The Women's Information Consultative Center in Ukraine deals with the collection, analysis, and dissemination of information on the activities of women's organizations and women's initiative in Ukraine and abroad. So as promised, we will start with Maksimas.
So my name is Maksimas Milta, and I'm Ukraine country director at the Reckoning Project. So basically what it stands for is that my primary role is to lead our work in Ukraine, the work of our team of researchers who are collecting testimonies of war crimes, but also staff who is based in Ukraine, as well as to make sure that our interactions with governmental stakeholders and other accountability actors in the field, just like any other interested parties, is smooth and productive, and to represent our organization internationally. So first, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to share some thoughts and perhaps lessons learned from our work on the ground in Ukraine, and also to be able to raise awareness about justice and accountability and what, among others, non-state actors can do on the matter, because normally the assumption is that the matters of international criminal law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, etc., they are the matters of governmental actors, right? Or of even perhaps international bodies, but not non-profits and non-governmental organizations. So what the Reckoning Project is doing, we are synergizing the power of journalistic storytelling with the power of strategic litigation. In other words, what we do is three things. First, we collect legally adhering testimonies of war crimes, and we do that in a survivor-centered way, mindful of different existing protocols and guidelines and nuances that exist there to make sure that the integrity of testimonies collected remains intact, therefore avoiding inadmissibility of those testimonies collected. The second pillar of our work is strategic litigation. So essentially working in the courts of law, and we do that through different fora, whether it be quasi-judicial instruments that are based predominantly on international treaty bodies, or using instruments like universal jurisdiction and others. The essence here is to use those instruments that international law equips us with in order to make perpetrators accountable. And the third pillar of our work is what we call the court of public opinion. In other words, to make sure that the discourse that exists there in the public space when it comes to Russian war crimes, it is reliable, it is truthful, it is based on human stories that we can provide, we can write, and we can articulate effectively, both to international audiences, but also to those audiences who we perceive as swinging audiences. In other words, those audiences that are not necessarily fully submerged into Kremlin disinformation campaigns and propaganda campaigns, but yet at the same time, for different reasons, very often also for reasons of domestic politics, they have certain doubts, certain biases, and we're trying to shed the light on the nature of atrocities that are committed either through war crimes or through severe violations of human rights in Ukraine by Russia. And we do that thematically on three major topics that we are working on in Ukraine since 2022. Almost immediately after the full-scale invasion started, we've been working on collecting testimonies of tortures of civilians. We've been working also extensively on abductions of children and some contextual elements of it that are not war crimes, but they, in our opinion, are as severe in terms of long-lasting repercussions. And by that, I mean indoctrination, or essentially efforts that are put by Russia in order to undermine Ukrainian identity of those kids who are either abducted or remain on temporarily occupied territories. And the last but not the least topic that is also of interest to us is forced conscription in temporarily occupied territories. So these thematically are the types of war crimes that we are mostly concentrated on. And as an organization, the Reckoning Project was founded by Janine DiGiovanni, who is a renowned American war journalist with decades of experience of working across more than 17 wars around the world, and also Peter Pomerantsev, who is an award-winning writer, and his particular field of expertise, among others, is Kremlin propaganda and disinformation, and also Natalia Gumenyuk, who is a founder of Public Interest Journalist Lab in Ukraine.
I would like to follow up already diving in the gender perspective, because from what you said, I can think of a lot of points on which we could explore a bit, expand from a gendered point of view. So what are the more gender-specific challenges that you see happening for people working at the Reckoning Project or for yourself?
Well, I think what is most intuitive that pops up in mind, of course, is that the nature of the war, the whole scale of the war, which perhaps should not be seen exclusively in the terms of February 24th, 2022 onwards, but rather from spring of 2014, it, of course, has a long-lasting impact on those who are the most vulnerable members of their respective communities. And it doesn't really matter in terms of regional distribution whether we are talking about those most vulnerable members of local communities, whether it be Donetsk or Luhansk oblasts, or whether it be Zaporizhia or Kherson or the very Crimea, for example. The fact remains that those who've been vulnerable before the war, they remain the most vulnerable during the war, as a general kind of framework of analysis, and therefore, for different reasons, and of course, many of them derive in historical and anthropological explanations of that, women have been more vulnerable in their respective local communities in Ukraine, and therefore, naturally, that the war only amplifies that. It is important, however, to stress that in Ukraine's efforts to resist, we see that it's not on, and very often, of course, again, for multiple reasons, the picture that we often can see that, men in uniform are, defending their homeland. That is, of course, true, but it's important to stress that slightly over 10% of Ukraine armed forces are actually women. If I recall correctly, it's somewhere around 12%, which is a very impressive figure, given the inevitable post-Soviet legacy of, among others, all of the structures of, for example, armed forces and etc. And that is not nothing, because when we think about the scope of that, it means that over 100,000 personnel in uniforms are women, which is important, again, in understanding the structure of not just society, but also the nature of involvement and engagement in the resistance, right? And that is a very strikingly different picture if you look, of course, at the same parameters within Russian armed forces, right? You can hardly see any women there at all, right, in uniforms. But not only, if a topic that is very not just close to our hearts and minds at the Reckoning Project, but that we've been persistently working over the course of almost last 2 years, and we have collected now over 200 testimonies of, is abduction of children. And although very often kids were abducted from different institutions, whether it be orphanages or other semi-orphanage style institutions, nevertheless, we see that in those individual efforts that are put in place by legal guardians and members of the family, distant relatives perhaps, to return these kids back, very often this burden falls again on women for different reasons, right? And very often it is the courage of, for example, grandmothers who are very, respected age, who, despite all odds, go deep inside Russia and trying to, in struggle with the Russian bureaucracy, and of course fueled by hatred to Ukraine, etc., trying to return their grandchildren, nephews, you name it, back to Ukraine, which is not necessarily something you can hear off on the headlines of major international media, but these individual acts of courage, they are important. In the experience of our work, we very often see that testimonies, for example, provided by witnesses. And here I must emphasize that in the approach we employ in collection of testimonies, we are talking about this first-hand knowledge. So we are not, for example, collecting things like hearsay, because not all of the statutes, they allow use of hearsay as a legitimate evidence if we are talking about court proceedings, for example, of these particular individual episodes of abductions of children. So we're talking about people like social workers, people like teachers in the schools, people like staff in those schools, principals in the schools. Very often, again, we're talking about women. And they, of course, have been very often psychologically, emotionally harassed by Russian occupying forces. Very often they were subjugated, by Russian occupation forces to essentially start working for them in these conditions of occupation, which not only in terms of ethics and morals is a very problematic situation, to say the least, but rather this is also the question of your own kind of stance and understanding of, is it not a betrayal, for example, right? If you are on one side and agreeing to continue that contract as a teacher, for example, in, let's say, the occupied part of Kherson region, but yet at the same time, your presence there on the ground may allow to take better care of those kids who remain on temporary occupied territories. And talking about kids, I just want to mention one figure. According to the estimates of major Ukrainian non-governmental organizations who are working, among other things, on returning abducted children, it's somewhere around 1.5 and 1.6 million children who remain on temporary occupied territories. So therefore, it's quite inseparable, because the war affects the entirety of the fabric of those local communities. And certainly those who were the most vulnerable ones remain even more undermined in the conditions of war. And of course, one of the most extreme versions of it would be occupation.
Okay, that's so, it's really interesting, because I think we were so focused on the gender perspective that maybe we missed looking at the entire fabric of society, as you mentioned. Because like one of the questions that that we had was about, the history of documenting these like war crimes. And I guess, would sexual violence fall under torture?
There are different ways how torture is conducted, right? And for example, one of the cases that we've been working on altogether, the Reckoning Project since 2022 collected close to 400 testimonies of torture of civilians. And sometimes, indeed, there is sexual violence used as a mean of torture, but otherwise, for example, electrification is used as a form of torture. And last year, we have filed a criminal complaint on the universal jurisdiction, which is a mechanism in international law that allows you to reach out to a third-party jurisdiction if domestic jurisdiction, for different reasons, cannot pursue some of the most severe, types of atrocities. And in the case of Ukraine, it's important to stress that the prosecutorial authorities, they are working well and they're well functioning. But at the moment, there are over 183,000 accounts of war crimes that are on record by the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. And this is simply the workload that would require decades, if not more, to deal with. So therefore, you need to find more human power, to more kind of counterparts who could, with regard to limitations of their statutes, can still pursue this particular atrocity. And we have filed this criminal complaint in Buenos Aires, Argentina, for a reason, because Argentina has a history of electrification being used as a form of torture during military junta. And also, it's important that the countries that are in the global south are not only engaged in terms of our attempts to provide to them reliable information, first-hand accounts of these experiences, either in the occupation or of war crimes, but also that there is a meaningful, technical, professional, let's say, engagement in the matter. And Argentinian legal system allows the use of universal jurisdiction. Therefore, we decided to take that advantage because we wanted to demonstrate to perpetrators that no matter how far you might be from the actual scene of the crime, the space of impunity can start shrinking. The difference of this particular war and these efforts that have been put in place right now to work in the whole accountability space and to document, among others, war crimes is that if we look at previous wars happening in the European continent, whether we look at the war in Bosnia, for example, or elsewhere, normally it took years after the war would stop so that the documentation process would start. Here, the war is taking place day and night, and efforts to document war crimes, whether it be double tap attacks, whether it be torture, whether it be abductions of children, whether it be environmental crime, etc., they are happening as we speak.
Connected to something that you said a while ago about the different roles that women can have in war, and I really appreciated you framing the entire situation. So seeing all of the women, some are victims and some are very vulnerable and they will suffer way more for the war than others. And some are more active actors and they play a part in the defense of Ukraine. So the question would be, how can we move beyond the narrative of women as victims? And maybe connected to this, now we see women differently, like people in Ukraine would see women differently for their participation in war. Did this perspective change in terms of evolving gender roles, or what else needs to happen and what can also be done internationally to reframe this narrative of women as victims of war?
Progress within the society, I think, is happening. And the figure that we started our conversation with, the number of women currently serving in the armed forces and who ultimately will be war veterans, that will be very important, right? Because the Soviet legacy, talking about war veterans, and that, of course, the rhetoric would be more about the Second World War, would often be talking about men, right? And the women, at the best, would be perceived as someone who would be assisting guerrilla fighters, but hardly would have any sort of agency of their own, right? If we're talking about a combatant kind of role, right? And here we have, over 100,000 combatant women, which is not nothing, right? It's a big figure. So I think that will help once women veterans are back in their communities. That certainly will be very visible. Currently, if you look at the media space, right, you see some commentaries, some statements, including among others by women veterans or by women in uniform, but certainly much less so than men. You hardly hear about women being in charge of any military command. At least I haven't noticed that. There are very renowned, very prominent men who are in charge of different military units in Ukraine, and they have their own aura around them. Of course, now Ukraine has a female prime minister, and that's the second female prime minister in Ukraine's history, which is important, right? Even in terms of optics, that is important, not to be disregarded. But nevertheless, I think that it's all about how you can see greater presence, a greater level of equality on the grassroots level, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about the picture that you see in the streets of Kyiv, right? Or like Lviv, I don't know, right? It's more about what is this picture you see in little towns of Kharkiv Oblast, or in little towns of Zaporizhia Oblast or Sumy Oblast, right? That is what matters, right? Because if you want to meaningfully address the matter, it is important not to disregard the grassroots level of those communities that are often set aside, that are not necessarily immediately at your imagination, I would say.
And in terms of more direct recommendations and things that could be done better or things that are already working well, both at the Ukrainian level and at the international level, so international actors of any kind, do you have in mind anything that could make women experience be heard better and be easier, from having more fitted uniforms, more money and resources for local NGOs, any kind of ideas, just to see from, of course, your perspective is very specific because the Reckoning Project is a very specific endeavor.
I think often role models do matter, right? And role models in different ways of life. And these role models is not something that you can impose through top-down approach, right? It's not that the head of president's administration of Ukraine will say, okay, now we should have 10 role model women for each, facet of life, right? And they will encourage, greater social cohesion and equality across the country. No, on the contrary, right? These role models should emerge on their own, despite all odds, despite all challenges, in different areas. And if you look, for example, at independent journalism in Ukraine, you have remarkable journalists, women, including, for example, war journalists. So that is happening, right? And I'm emphasizing here war journalism because, again, for different reasons, different stigmas, for different historical, anthropological experiences, this topic has been less, let's say, covered by women in this part of the world rather than by men, right? And war, of course, is number one issue in the country. Of course, there are other role models in the sports, in culture, in fashion, in other areas, but there can be more. Again, I think that it is inevitable that we'll see greater presence of women in politics, in decision making, in academia, in elsewhere. But in order to be able to pursue that, Ukrainians themselves need to realize that this is the need. And of course, in the condition of war, in the conditions when there are individual nights when Russia uses up to 700 air targets against Ukraine, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, etc. Not always, gender dimension is seen as number one problem, right?
Thank you so much, Maksimas. Now on to our discussion with Olena.
Could you tell me a bit more about your career and the things you've fought for over the years?
Recently, July 13, we celebrated 30 years of our NGO. And for me, it is a time for reflections, for thoughts, particularly because it was the year of Beijing conference, and I did participate in the Beijing conference. And for Ukraine, it was the first conference when we did participate as a independent country. And I remember during the conference when I were asked, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Ukraine. Uganda? And they said, yes, sure, Uganda. So, sure, it could be. And for me personally, Beijing conference became very good school, very good university, and many inspirational things, many inspiration, much inspiration and meeting till now support me and give me energy even in such hard times for Ukraine as we have now.
Completely. I think you need a source for energy somewhere. Otherwise, you just be let down by everything. So I think that's a really good point to go into our the topic of our conversation, which is how gender roles have influenced the war in Ukraine and how they've been changed by the war. And I'd want to set the scene for people who maybe don't know as much about Ukraine or maybe only knew stereotypes about Ukraine before the war started. So what were some of the gender roles in Ukraine before the war? What was a woman's expected place in society?
Last year, in December, we did celebrate 140 years of women's movement in Ukraine. Therefore, we did not start before the war. We even did not start when we renovated our independence in 1991. We started much early. At the same time, as a colony of Russian Emporium and post-Russian Emporium Soviet Union, it was not easy to do it because really many things were not possible for us. Therefore, with renovation of independence of Ukraine in 91, we started to do our gender work actually immediately. I started, you asked me about my founding role in Women's Information Consultative Center. I started early. I started as a member of Helsinki group. And therefore, human rights and women's rights, it is something very basic. And we had a lot of challenges. We have now a lot of challenges, a lot of tasks. At the same time, our gender work we do many years. And therefore, before the war, it was not like something absolutely behind of all these rights. Much more, I'd like to tell that some things what we are doing on gender equality and women, peace and security agenda, it is really not only now, but much earlier, could be interesting, important, and useful for other countries, so-called developed, because really part of our resilience now, it is also roles of women and men, our attitude and our values related to this.
I think it's really important work and really groundbreaking. And I'm wondering, because you've had these long-term efforts, how have they culminated now in the midst of a war? How do people think about Ukrainian women?
We continue to work, and one of very important thing, it is very related to big discussions at NATO summit in this year about 5%. And I did participate in the parallel event before the NATO summit as a member of civil society advisory panel. And I said, it is not competition between defense, between security, and between development. We in Ukraine, even after the large-scale invasion, we didn't stop it. After 22, we did approve two strategies. One of strategies about decrease the gap in the salary between women and men, and other strategy related gender equality till 2030. We did ratify Istanbul Convention. We continue to do it, and actually we try to bring together all strata of society, military, civil, authority. It is not ideal situation, actually. We have a lot of problems with all this strata. At the same time, we try to do it, we try to work it. And one of important thing, what we actually, I mean, our organization, me personally, what we try to do, do not make opposition between women and men in our way to gender equality. And all time, when we are doing our training, our conversation, our advocacy work, we try to tell gender equality is our future, what is good for all. It is not the time when women will take all dictatorship roles among society and will be something anti-patriarchat situation. We do not need it. And despite many things looks like very idealistic, at the same time, we are idealists.
I'm curious about, because you mentioned maybe misunderstandings around gender equality in Ukraine. Now, the new front almost of gender equality is actually the front lines. And Ukraine, I know, has women's voluntary military registration. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a bit about how that has made Ukraine's war different to other wars, and whether you think that there should be conscription for women like there is for men.
Sabina, actually, I like your question because no similar wars. And it is one of mistakes very often, questions that I'm asked, comparing with Second World War. But I tell, the situation is different. Many tendencies we could see the same. At the same time, the strength of these tendencies is different. War is different. Tools are different. And therefore, roles of women are very different. Stereotypes are much more stronger. And very often, but I know it is before the war, before the Russian aggression, that stereotypes does exist even in cases when it does not exist in reality. And very often we saw it. At the same time, some of similar tendencies, for example. If you remember this picture, this drawing, we can do it. When I saw it first time, many years ago, I thought, oh, it is very, very good demonstration of our power. At the same time, then I knew later it was being done not because gender equality. It was being done because men were annihilated by war and economy needed. We can do it the same now. At the same time, we remember how it was when men returned back. And we understand it could be really very hard and try to disbalance all these situations. Therefore, we run. We try to run. We try to do as much as possible in this area. For example, our organization recently, we initiated analytical centers, women, peace and security in some strong military universities, because we would like to have this networking, this interconnection. We would like to develop as much as possible this capacity, individual and institutional capacity. I think it is very important to have some kind of revision of all documents, like in our great 1325 resolution about participation of women in peace negotiation, etc.
And I want to look very practically at how women fight in this war. What is war actually for the women soldiers on the front lines?
One of parts of our resilience, many civilians came to armed forces, and they brought civic values, civil understanding of modern peace, etc. Stereotypes continue to be, but stereotypes are ambivalent. It is not only about stereotypes from outside. One of examples, we have one woman who is chief of a military unit, cannoneer, artillerist. She graduated military university at this faculty. 500 women graduated cannoneer faculty. What do you think? How many women became artillerists?
less than 10%, I would say.
One.
Just one.
Just one. They continue to be in the armed forces at the same time in staff, in other positions.
Because I think many people might not know the structure of Ukrainian society now at war. Beyond the women who are on the front lines and people like you who are helping from the sides, how are women contributing to the war effort? What is their place, and how can we enhance their participation in non-combative roles?
Now I'm not asked anymore by some international foreign experts about why the role of women in Ukraine in decision making is so low, because it's not. This week we have Prime Minister who is woman. She came from economy ministry. It is very important part of our life, and it is very important field for periods of war. In new cabinet of ministers, we have minister of energy, and she is really very strong. And it is very important because she worked in the ecological issues and energetic issues. Also, we had very strong women during all war since 2014 at the position of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Ivana Klipushtinsadze and later Olena Suslova. It is about decision making. During the war, in 18, Cabinet of Ministers established the position of Governmental Commissioner for Gender Equality. And it is very important because this position is not included in our law, because the law is old of 2005, but it does exist from government to government. Despite it's not included in the law, but new government continue to support this position. Now women are very engaged in different positions, what was traditionally not female fields, like crane drivers, truck drivers, the miners, and many other things. And really, also energetics, like solar panels, and all these things are important for all, for business, for society, for future, for resilience, for women, because all these areas, they have much higher position for payment. And for us, it is very important economical empowerment of women.
I'm also thinking about a lot of the women who in Ukraine, beyond just like you being the targets of air attacks, also the ones who are closer to the front lines, who have been the victim of gender-based violence at the hands of Russian soldiers. What will it take to help those women heal and build a better future for themselves?
I would like to bring some correction. We do not consider seriously conflict-related sexual violence as a gender-based violence as a part. Mm-hmm. Differentiate it because it is a sexualized torture. Conflict-related sexual violence is sexualized torture, and for example, age of survivors from 4 years till 82. It is really about this torture. And proportion between women and men is practically 50-50. Sometimes more men, sometimes more women. I started to work with investigator in Security Service of Ukraine April 10th. It was actually in 1 and little bit months after the large-scale invasion started. And we started to help investigators because they had no idea what to do, how to do. That time we used international protocol. And CRSV prepared in UK. It was very helpful. And we did prepare the first checklist for investigators. We did prepare a lot of materials and other organizations. And already in May 22, Ukraine and UN system signed memorandum. Therefore, we started to work about it immediately. I remember how hard was our work in 22 because deep wounded people, recently wounded, we worked it and we didn't see results. It was so hard. And I remember in November 22, we sit down with our colleagues and said that it is very difficult to work when you do not see any progress. And actually, the next meeting, what was in several days, we came and we saw changes stuff.
And to give you one last question and sum up everything that we've talked about, what would you say is women's place in creating a lasting and fair and just peace for Ukraine? Not just a vision, but very concrete recommendations from what you've seen is lacking or not functioning well enough.
I think it is not only about Ukraine. It is a general tendency. Women should be included more in military planning, implementation of operations, and military negotiation. It is important. Actually, defense sector has three levels: strategic, operational, tactical, operational, less strategic, tactical, and it is a way to lasting peace because we can't start when the war is over. We can't do it during the war because it is about combination of our experience. It is about combination of our knowledge. It is about combination of our resilience. And by the way, one of the analytical centers of NATO considered that cognitive superiority and layered resilience, 2 of 5 battlefield concept cornerstone in Ukraine because gender component really is strong.
Thank you so much to our two lovely guests for sharing their insights about the past and the present role of women in Ukraine and giving us some inspiration as to what the future might hold. We will continue this mini-series about women, peace and security in the following weeks, sprinkled in throughout our regular episodes. So tune in to listen to more incredible insights from people who have truly shaped the WPS agenda. In the meantime, please engage in the conversation on social media. We are on LinkedIn and Instagram. You might have already come from there. Let us know what you think, and you'll hear from me next Friday.